James Warren was not like others. He didn't crave public fame, nor did he seek recognition. All he needed was peace, space for himself, and the chance to restore balance after years spent in the chaotic world of engineering and management. After decades of working for large companies and managing stressful projects, he decided to leave the noisy city and move to a quiet suburban town. Here, in what was once an abandoned farm, James found his refuge. The pond, which had once served as a fishing spot left over from the old homesteads, became something much more than just a body of water to him. It was a place where he could forget the world, disconnect, and reconnect with what mattered: inner peace and a connection to nature. When he first saw the pond, covered in duckweed and moss, his heart nearly stopped at the sense of seclusion and beauty in this corner. He was certain that this place was made for a new beginning. James started with the basics. Restoring the land took time and effort, but for him it was an exciting process. He cleaned the pond, repaired old wooden bridges that once led to the small island in the middle of the water, and made the land more comfortable for relaxation. He built a small garden, laid stone paths, and even planted a few trees to create the atmosphere of a secluded retreat where anyone could feel like part of nature. Occasionally, he would take his fishing rod and sit by the water, catching fish and enjoying the quiet that surrounded him. All he needed was a few hours of peace, a few hours alone with himself. He always considered himself someone who didn't need much. His life was simple, and that was its greatest value. He didn't desire luxury or the signs of success that had become so important to most of his former colleagues. All he wanted was the chance to work with his hands and see the results of his efforts in every corner of the property. He enjoyed this process, and each day brought new discoveries about himself and the world around him. He kept checking how his own efforts could change the space, and he felt alive in that change. James wasn't the typical person who buys land for profit. He wasn't a businessman, and his motivation wasn't to use his property for commercial gain. His plot was his personal project, his place for restoration and creation. He didn't think about ever selling it or turning it into something more. In his eyes, this land was already everything he needed, and he was ready to take care of it for the rest of his life. At that moment, his life was peaceful, and it seemed that nothing could disrupt this ideal. But everything changed when he received the first letter. He hadn't expected his life to change because of an official letter that came in the mail. It was written in formal language, stating that his pond didn't belong solely to him. It claimed that the area with the water was a communal resource and should be used by all residents of the district. James read the letter several times, trying to understand what the sender meant. He was sure that the pond and the land it stood on were his property, and no one had told him how he should use this land. He didn't know what it meant, so he just set the letter aside, thinking it was some kind of mistake. But a few weeks later, the situation hadn't improved. New signs began appearing on his property, and they all prohibited fishing. A fence was put up, and someone placed a sign saying that the pond was part of a shared land resource now controlled by local authorities. James was in shock. He didn't know what to do, so he first tried to understand the situation. By calling the local administration, he found out that, in fact, his land wasn't entirely private. The pond and several surrounding plots were owned by the municipality, and the local community was responsible for these lands. This meant that he didn't have the right to use the water as he had assumed. The local council fined him for violations concerning the ecosystem of the pond, and warned him of serious penalties if he continued fishing there without the proper permission. James was confused. He didn't know what to do next, and at first he tried to ignore the letters. He continued relaxing by the pond, but one day, after a fishing trip, he noticed new signs on his property. These were signs prohibiting fishing. A fence had been erected, and there were notices saying that the pond was part of a shared land resource now under the control of local authorities. James was taken aback. He didn't understand what was going on. He had never received any notification of this change. All this time, He had thought the pond was his personal retreat. He didn't know how to react to this new reality. James was faced with a challenge he had never expected. He had no intention of giving up his land, his space for relaxation, so easily. This was not just about fish or a body of water. It was about his right to live peacefully and control the land he had worked so hard to restore. The calm life he had dreamed of was now threatened. He had to act, but he didn't yet know how. At that moment, James made a decision. He would not back down. He would not let local authorities or investors take away his land and the pond. This wasn't just a fight over property. It was a fight for his right to live in peace. James wasn't prepared to just give up. He began searching for ways to preserve his land, and soon realized that the only way forward was to challenge the system that was trying to take his property away. And that's when the story of his struggle began. James Warren had never imagined that a peaceful life in the countryside would be disrupted so suddenly. It wasn't as if he had asked for trouble. He had always been the type of man who preferred to keep to himself, focused on his work and the simple pleasures of nature. His days revolved around tending to his garden, fishing by the pond, and enjoying the solitude that the land provided. The surrounding town had always seemed like a distant reality, and he liked it that way. But that was before the first letter arrived, and now everything he had worked for, everything he had built with his own hands, was under threat. The letter had been like a bolt from the blue, a harsh reminder that the land he had worked so hard to restore didn't belong to him in the way he had thought. James had always been meticulous about the details when it came to his property. He knew the boundaries, the history, and the legalities of everything around him, or so he thought. The local council had sent him a notice claiming that the pond, along with the land surrounding it, was not privately owned, as James had believed, but was part of a communal resource governed by the community's regulations. According to the letter, the pond had once served as a vital part of the local water system, and while it had fallen into disrepair over the years, it was still considered a shared asset, subject to the oversight of the local residents' association. James had stared at the letter for a long time, reading and rereading the lines that seemed to imply he had no legal claim to the very land he had poured his soul into. He had always prided himself on being independent, on standing on his own 2 feet, but this felt like a betrayal, an encroachment into his private world. He knew he had to investigate further, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His first instinct was to simply ignore it, to continue living his life as he had before. But when the second letter arrived, a more formal notice demanding he cease and desist from using the pond for fishing, he realized that this issue wasn't going to go away. The local authorities were determined to make their presence felt, and James wasn't sure if they had any right to do so. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and meetings. He contacted a local lawyer, a man named Thomas Langley, who had a reputation for being tough but fair. James explained his situation, laying out his belief that the pond had always been part of his property and that he had never been informed of any shared rights. Langley listened attentively but didn't give much away, and after a few minutes he asked to meet James at his property. James agreed, hoping that the lawyer would be able to provide some clarity. But when Langley arrived, it only raised more questions. "James, I've done some research," Langley began, pacing slowly along the pond's edge, where the water lapped gently at the shore. "And it seems that while the land itself was indeed privately owned, there are historical documents that state the pond was part of a larger network of water sources that supplied the town. Now, whether or not that still holds any weight today is a different matter entirely, but we need to be cautious here. If there's any legal standing to their claims, we could be facing something much bigger than a simple dispute over fishing rights." James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had always assumed the land was his, that everything within his boundaries was for him to use as he pleased. To hear that the pond might have been considered part of a larger system, one that was subject to communal rules, was unsettling. But what troubled him even more was Langley's mention of historical documents. James had spent months researching the history of the farm before he had purchased it, carefully looking through deeds and past ownership records, but he had never seen anything that hinted at the pond's communal status. It felt like the kind of bureaucratic oversight that was more about controlling property than about protecting public interests. Determined to get to the bottom of things, James decided to visit the town's archives where the old records were kept. He spent hours sifting through dusty files and documents, searching for any mention of the pond. And then, in an old yellowed deed from the early 1900s, he found what he was looking for. The document referred to a shared waterway that ran through multiple properties, including the farm that James had purchased. It stated that the pond had once been used to support a community irrigation system, and that over the years the land had been divided among several owners. There was a clause that allowed for the communal use of the pond by all residents in the area, but it had been somewhat vague about how those rights were to be exercised. James felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. This wasn't just about fishing rights, this was about the very land he had thought was his. He had never known about the communal water rights, and if the town's local government was still operating under these old agreements, it meant he could be at risk of losing his property altogether. James knew he couldn't fight this on his own. He needed help, and he needed it fast. He went back to Langley with the document, hoping that it would give them the leverage they needed to challenge the local authorities. Langley, however, was quiet for a long time before speaking. "This is troubling, James," he said slowly. "This document could give them the legal grounds they need to claim control of the pond. It's clear that at some point they established a communal right to the water, but it's not clear whether that right still exists. The only way to truly understand the legal implications of this is to dig deeper into the town's records and see how the laws have evolved over the years." James was frustrated. He didn't have the time or the resources to launch a full-scale legal battle. He needed answers now, and he needed to make sure that the land he had worked so hard to restore would remain his. Langley suggested contacting the town's legal department and requesting a copy of the current regulations surrounding the use of shared water sources, but James was reluctant. He didn't want to give the town any more ammunition to use against him. Instead, James decided to take matters into his own hands. He started talking to neighbors, trying to find out if anyone else knew about the pond's history or if anyone had dealt with the local authorities about it before. One elderly man, Mr. Thompson, who lived a few houses down, seemed to know more than he let on. After a few casual conversations, Thompson finally admitted that he had been involved in the original agreement that had allowed the community to share the water from the pond. It had been a long time ago, but Thompson recalled that the agreement had been part of a deal to help the town's agricultural community. However, over the years, as the area had developed and the original farms had been sold off, the agreement had been forgotten by many, and now it seemed to be resurfacing at the worst possible time. It was clear to James that the situation was more complex than he had imagined. He couldn't just ignore the letters and threats anymore. He had to act quickly, but now he had a bigger question. How could he defend his property from the forces that were determined to take it from him? And what if these forces weren't just local government officials, but also the very people who lived around him, people who had been quietly complicit in the communal rights agreement for decades? James knew that the next few weeks would determine the course of his future, and he was prepared to fight for his land no matter what it took. The catalyst for everything that followed had been that first letter, that small piece of paper that had opened the door to a much larger conflict. James had always believed that his home was his sanctuary, his place of peace, but now, as he stared down the growing threat to his land, he realized that the true fight for his future was just beginning. The stakes were higher than ever, and he wasn't sure who he could trust. The only thing he knew for sure was that he wouldn't go down without a fight. James had no intention of letting go of his land so easily. The more he thought about it, the more the whole situation seemed like an elaborate maneuver, a quiet takeover dressed up as a legal formality. He had already invested too much time, effort, and money into restoring the pond and the surrounding property to let it slip away because of an ancient, obscure agreement he hadn't even known about. The letter that had arrived weeks ago was merely the first warning shot, but it hadn't deterred him. It had only fueled his determination. The more James considered his options, the clearer it became. He would fight this, and he would fight it hard. James decided to act swiftly, beginning with a meeting with his lawyer, Thomas Langley, who, despite his reservations, was becoming more involved in the case. Langley had always been straightforward with him, which was why James trusted him. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. The local authorities weren't just being bureaucratic. They were making moves that could cost James his land and his peaceful existence. Langley had advised James to take a cautious approach, suggesting that they first try to work within the legal framework, to get more clarity on the situation from the local government and perhaps come to some agreement. But James wasn't interested in compromise. He wasn't going to let anyone waltz in and claim ownership of his land, especially when it had been in his family's name for decades. The morning after his meeting with Langley, James found himself standing in front of the local government office. He had called ahead to schedule an appointment, but no one had warned him about the cold reception he was about to receive. The building, an outdated municipal office that looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades, was tucked away in the middle of town, surrounded by shops and residential buildings. As he walked through the worn-out door and into the reception area, he could immediately feel the tension in the air. The secretary behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with an air of indifference, barely looked up from her computer when he introduced himself. "Yes?" she asked, her voice flat. "I'm here to meet with someone about a property dispute," James said, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. "It concerns the pond on my land." She finally glanced up, her gaze icy. "You'll need to wait. The person you need to speak to is busy." James was used to bureaucratic red tape, but this felt different. The woman didn't make any attempt to be helpful, and when he sat down to wait, he noticed that no one else seemed to be in any hurry. The silence in the room was almost oppressive, and after what felt like an eternity, a man in a suit appeared from the back office. He was tall and thin, with a stern expression that made James immediately uneasy. "You're James Warren?" the man asked, not bothering with a handshake. His tone was clipped, and his demeanor made it clear that James wasn't welcome here. "Yes, that's right," James replied, forcing himself to remain calm. "I'm Robert Hayes. I'm the one handling your case," the man said as he gestured toward a chair. "Follow me." James stood and followed Hayes through a narrow corridor into a small, dimly lit office. Hayes sat behind a desk cluttered with papers and files, and James took the seat across from him, feeling a surge of frustration building in his chest. Hayes wasted no time getting to the point. "So, you're here because you've received some letters regarding the pond on your property?" Hayes began, leaning back in his chair as he folded his hands. "That's right," James said, keeping his voice measured. "I've looked into the history of the land, and I've spoken to some of my neighbors. This pond has always been part of my property, and I don't see why the town has any claim to it now." Hayes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shuffled through a pile of papers on his desk before pulling out a document and sliding it across to James. "This is the original deed from when your property was subdivided," Hayes said. "It's dated over 100 years ago. As you can see, the pond is explicitly listed as a shared waterway." James's eyes narrowed as he scanned the document. There it was in black and white. The pond was marked as a communal resource, used by the town for irrigation and other public purposes. It was a legal clause, one that had been included in the deed when the land was first divided. But James had never seen this document before, and he certainly hadn't been informed about the communal rights when he had bought the property. The realization hit him hard. The town had more legal ground to stand on than he'd realized. "This doesn't change the fact that I've been living here for years without anyone mentioning these so-called communal rights," James said, trying to control his rising anger. If this pond was really a shared resource, why hasn't anyone told me about it? Why am I just finding out now? Hayes's expression remained unchanged, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something like annoyance or perhaps even a touch of satisfaction. You must understand, Mr. Warren, that this is all part of a larger process. The town is simply reasserting its claim over a resource that has been neglected for too long. The pond has been underused, and the town council has decided it's time to make the area a more regulated space. This will help with the development plans for the surrounding land. James's mind raced. Development plans. This was about more than just fishing rights. This was about control. The local government, along with the investors, was trying to secure the land for themselves, and now they were using legal loopholes to justify their actions. James realized that the fight he was facing was much bigger than he had imagined. "You're telling me this pond is part of a plan for development?" James asked, his voice tense. "You mean you're planning to sell off the surrounding land?" Hayes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the town below. James's gaze followed his, and for a moment, he thought he saw the faintest smirk on Hayes's face. "I'm not saying anything specific," Hayes said finally, turning back to face James. "But yes, there are plans in place for the area. The town has been in talks with several developers, and the land around the pond could potentially be part of a larger project in the future. However, these things take time. The important thing now is that we resolve your situation and ensure that all the proper procedures are followed." James stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He had heard enough. He had never been a man to sit idly by when something mattered to him, and now, more than ever, it felt like he was being pushed into a corner. "This is about more than just some paperwork," James said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "You're talking about taking control of land that doesn't belong to you. I won't let you get away with this." Hayes didn't flinch. He simply nodded, as if he had expected this reaction. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Warren," Hayes said, his tone now colder. "But I'd advise you to proceed carefully. The town has its own interests to protect, and it's in your best interest to resolve this peacefully. If you continue to fight this, you'll only make things more difficult for yourself." James felt a surge of determination rising within him. There was no way he was going to back down now. He had spent too long building this life, too many years restoring his land, to let someone come in and take it away under the guise of legality. Hayes's cold threats were nothing more than intimidation tactics, and James wasn't about to be cowed by them. "I'll consider your advice," James said, his voice tight, "but I'm not backing down." As he left the office, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, and the more he learned about the town's plans, the more determined he became. He knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let them take what was rightfully his. But as James made his way back to his property, he realized the fight was going to be harder than he had expected. The local authorities were just the tip of the iceberg. The real threat was much larger, and it was closing in on him from all sides. This was no longer just a legal dispute. It was a battle for his future. James spent the following weeks feeling the weight of his decisions pressing down on him with increasing intensity. What had started as a small dispute over fishing rights was rapidly morphing into something much larger, and it became clear that the stakes were far higher than he had anticipated. He had thought the fight would be simple, just a matter of proving his ownership of the land, asserting his rights, and moving on with his life. Instead, he found himself trapped in a web of bureaucracy, corporate interests, and legal ambiguity, each new layer revealing more about the forces at play behind the scenes. He knew that the authorities were no longer just interested in controlling the pond or the land. It was something far more sinister, After the meeting with Robert Hayes, James had left the local government office feeling frustrated, but more determined than ever to hold his ground. Hayes had made it clear that the town had intentions to develop the area, but he had been vague about the specifics. There had been talk of a larger project in the works, but no concrete details had been offered. James knew that the town wasn't just interested in regulating water rights, they were after something bigger, something that would fundamentally change the nature of the land he had come to cherish. The sense of unease that had taken root in his gut only grew stronger as days passed. In the following weeks, James found himself digging deeper into the history of the land and its surrounding properties. He knew he needed more information if he was going to challenge the authorities. He'd already contacted a local historian, hoping to find clues that could help him piece together a better understanding of the legal landscape. But the deeper he delved, the more entangled the situation became. He began to uncover strange inconsistencies in the land's historical ownership records. There were gaps, periods where ownership transferred hands without clear documentation, or where the land had been part of a larger scheme of water rights redistribution. The more he uncovered, the more it became evident that the town had been involved in shady dealings for years, selling land, buying land, and making decisions that benefited developers, all while operating under the guise of community welfare. One afternoon, while poring over old blueprints and archival documents at the local historical society, James came across something that took him completely by surprise. In a dusty file tucked away in a back corner, he found a map from the early 1900s that showed not just the pond, but the surrounding land as part of an extensive irrigation system used by several local farms. At first glance, the map seemed innocuous enough, but as he examined it closer, James's heart sank. There, in small print along the side, was a clause that read, "All water rights are held in trust by the local authority, to be managed for the benefit of the community and future generations." James stared at the words, reading them over and over. Again, it was clear now. The pond had been designated as a shared resource from the very beginning. The town had always intended to control it. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he truly knew about the land he had so confidently purchased. The documents he had seen when buying the property had been carefully curated to make it seem like everything was in order, but they had omitted this critical piece of information. It was as if the entire legal system had been designed to keep the people who lived there in the dark about what was really happening. James couldn't shake the feeling that the town's motives weren't entirely honest. He had already suspected that there was something more at play than just an interest in preserving the pond, and now his suspicions were confirmed. The town had long ago agreed to these shared water rights, and it was clear that they had been using them as leverage ever since. What struck him even more was the realization that these rights had been quietly transferred to a private development company, a company that had been working behind the scenes with the local government to secure land for a massive new residential development. This wasn't just about fishing rights or land ownership. It was about gentrification, about selling off public resources to the highest bidder, and about forcing out people like him who had no idea what was going on behind closed doors. The more James uncovered, the more it became apparent that the town was in cahoots with developers, willing to sell off its land to create a shiny new neighborhood that would raise property values and attract wealthy buyers. But James had no intention of becoming another casualty of their greed. Determined to get to the bottom of it all, James decided to take a different approach. Instead of fighting the local authorities head-on, he needed to find out who was really behind the development project, the people pulling the strings in the shadows. His first clue came when he learned that the development company that had been quietly acquiring land in the area was called Redwood Enterprises. At first, the name meant nothing to James, but as he dug deeper, he realized that Redwood Enterprises was no ordinary development firm. It was a large, well-connected corporation with ties to some of the wealthiest individuals in the country. Redwood Enterprises had been buying up land all over the region, including land adjacent to James's property, and it was clear that they had big plans for the area. James's stomach churned as he realized that the town wasn't just interested in the pond, they were interested in turning the entire neighborhood into a luxury development, and they had been working with Redwood Enterprises to make that happen. What's worse, James learned that Redwood had already secured the rights to the neighboring properties, and it wouldn't be long before they came for his land as well. He couldn't allow that to happen. James needed more information, and he knew he couldn't do it alone. He reached out to an old friend, Maria Ortiz, a former investigative reporter who had worked for a major city newspaper before retiring to the area. Maria had always been sharp, and James knew that her skills as a journalist could help him uncover the truth. They met at a local cafe, where James filled her in on what he had discovered so far. Maria listened carefully, her brow furrowed with concern as James explained how the town, the developers, and the local government seemed to be working together to secure the area for future development. "This is bigger than you think," Maria said after a long pause. "They've been doing this all over the state, buying up land, pushing people out, and using their connections to manipulate zoning laws. You've stumbled onto something much larger than just a property dispute. This is about power and money." James nodded, his mind racing. "What do we do now?" Maria smiled, a glint of determination in her eyes. "We go after them. We expose everything." Maria's plan was simple. They would dig deeper into the town's dealings with Redwood Enterprises and the local authorities, gather evidence, and bring the story to light. But this wouldn't be easy. Redwood Enterprises had vast resources at their disposal, and they wouldn't hesitate to use them to protect their interests. Maria warned James that they would be up against some powerful forces, but she also reminded him that the truth was on their side. With Maria's help, James began to piece together the full extent of the conspiracy. They interviewed former employees of the development company, spoke with local residents who had witnessed shady dealings, and combed through court records and zoning documents to find any evidence that could prove their case. As the pieces fell into place, James began to see just how deep the corruption ran. Redwood Enterprises wasn't just buying land. They were buying influence, bribing officials and using every dirty trick in the book to force people like him off their land. James had entered this fight thinking it was about his property rights, but now he realized that it was about something much bigger. This was a fight for the soul of his community, a fight to protect the people who had lived in this area for generations from being pushed out by corporate greed. And he wasn't going to back down. This was just the beginning. The middle of the battle had arrived, and James was ready to take it to the next level. He wasn't just fighting for his pond anymore. He was fighting for the future of his land, his community, and everything that had brought him to this place in the first place. The road ahead would be hard, but James was prepared to face whatever came his way. James stood at the threshold of something far bigger than he had ever anticipated. The road from mere frustration over fishing rights had turned into a sprawling, multifaceted legal battle, one that now threatened not just his land but the very fabric of his community. The more he uncovered, the more entrenched the forces against him seemed to be. There were moments when he felt completely overwhelmed by the scale of the fight, when he would lay awake at night, his mind racing, wondering if he had made a mistake by challenging the system, by digging too deep into a problem that seemed insurmountable. But in those quiet moments of doubt, a stronger, more resolute part of him pushed through. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything that had been revealed. Maria Ortiz had proved invaluable in their fight. Her experience as an investigative reporter had given them the tools to dig deeper into Redwood Enterprises' connections with the town council and the shady dealings that were taking place behind closed doors. Together, they had uncovered a mountain of evidence pointing to corruption at every level of government and business. Bribed officials, manipulated zoning laws, and backroom deals with developers. James had seen firsthand how much influence Redwood had, how seamlessly they controlled everything around them, from the local government to the very media that should have been exposing the truth. It became increasingly clear that this wasn't just about the pond. It was about corporate interests slowly but surely erasing the heart of the community, replacing it with cookie-cutter houses, fancy amenities, and exclusive neighborhoods that would push out the longtime residents. Still, James knew that exposing the truth wouldn't be enough to stop them. What they were facing was a machine built on years of systemic corruption. It was too ingrained, too protected, and their adversaries were far too powerful for a simple media exposé to bring them down. But they had to try. The very idea that people like him could be brushed aside, forgotten, and ignored was unacceptable. Maria had suggested they go public with their findings, that they rally the community and pressure the local authorities to act. The idea was that with enough public outcry, the council might be forced to reconsider their development plans, or at the very least, expose some of the more sinister aspects of the project. But James was no fool. He knew that going public meant exposing himself to more than just legal retaliation. It meant making enemies who would stop at nothing to crush him. It wasn't long before the pressure began to mount. James and Maria's carefully orchestrated plan to expose the truth started to gain traction. A few local journalists had picked up on the story, and what had initially seemed like an isolated issue began to turn into a full-blown scandal. Slowly, the public began to take notice. A few town meetings later, and it seemed as though the majority of the residents were beginning to question the project. Whispers of corruption circulated among the older members of the community, who had long suspected that something was wrong but had never dared to speak up. James, now a reluctant symbol of resistance, began to see support from people who had previously been silent, from neighbors who had been too afraid to challenge the growing influence of the developers. Yet, as the walls began to close in on Redwood Enterprises and the local government, the stakes grew higher, and the threats became more overt. One evening, after a particularly charged town hall meeting where James had made an impassioned speech about the future of the community, he returned to his property to find something waiting for him. A note. Simple, direct, and terrifying. The message was clear. Stop. This ends now. If you keep pushing, we will make you wish you hadn't. It wasn't the first threat he'd received, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't the usual vague warnings. This one was personal, and it left no room for misinterpretation. James had been warned before, but this was the first time he truly understood how far Redwood Enterprises was willing to go to silence him. The next few days were a blur of escalating tension. As Maria continued to gather evidence, documents that detailed the depth of Redwood's influence and the full extent of the town council's corruption, James began to notice strange things happening around his property. Unmarked cars parked across the street, surveillance drones hovering just beyond his line of sight, and whispers from neighbors who were now speaking in hushed tones, no longer willing to meet his gaze. It was becoming clear that Redwood Enterprises was not going to let him interfere with their plans. If he was going to stop them, he would have to do it quickly and decisively, before things escalated any further. In the midst of all this, James received an unexpected call. It was Langley, his lawyer. There was a new development, an ominous one. Redwood Enterprises had filed for an injunction, seeking to prevent James from publicly disclosing any more of their dealings. They were also pursuing a counterclaim, alleging that James had violated zoning laws by making unauthorized modifications to his property, which they argued had damaged the surrounding environment. It was a legal maneuver designed to not only discredit him but to tie him up in court for months, if not years. The message was clear. Back down or face a never-ending legal battle. Redwood knew that they had more resources at their disposal than James ever could, and they were willing to use every last one of them. It was at this point that James realized the true scale of the fight he was in. The deck was stacked against him, and it wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about his freedom, his ability to stand up for what he believed was right. He could see now how the system worked. Power, money, and influence twisted into a machine that crushed anything in its path. And the people who should have been his allies, the town council, the local officials, were either complicit or too afraid to act. He was alone. But as much as it hurt to admit, James knew this was not the moment to falter. This was the moment to dig in his heels and fight, not just for his property, but for the soul of the town. With Maria's help, James began preparing for the fight of his life. They reached out to more people in the community, attempting to rally support from those who still had doubts about the development project. He knew that their only hope was to make their voices heard, to expose Redwood Enterprises and the local officials for what they truly were. It wasn't just about stopping the development. It was about proving that they couldn't be bought, that the power of the people still mattered. But as they strategized, James felt the pressure mounting. The threats were becoming more direct, and he was starting to wonder whether his personal safety, let alone the future of the town, was worth the risk. But one thing became clear to him. He had no choice. He had started something, and now he had to see it through, no matter the cost. As the legal battles intensified, so too did the tactics of Redwood Enterprises. They began to escalate their harassment. Anonymous letters flooded James's mailbox, and a few of his neighbors received similar threats. He was followed on his daily trips to town, and strange vehicles seemed to hover just out of sight. One night, as James returned to his home, a brick was thrown through his window with a note attached. "Enough. You're out of your depth. This ends now." The feeling of being watched was constant, and James realized that the fight had moved beyond legal and public realms. It was now a matter of survival. Redwood Enterprises and the corrupt officials had drawn a line in the sand, and James had crossed it. But there was no turning back. With every step, the risks increased, but so did his resolve. He had been pushed to the brink, but it was clear that his determination was now his greatest weapon. The legal battle would continue. The threats would keep coming. But James knew that as long as he kept fighting, the truth would eventually come to light. The more they tried to silence him, the louder his voice would become. He wasn't just fighting for his property anymore. He was fighting for the community, for the future of the land he loved, and for the principle that no one should have the power to take what was rightfully theirs without consequence. The battle was just beginning, and James was prepared to see it through to the end. The tension had reached a breaking point, and James could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him. Every day had become a test of endurance, a constant struggle to maintain control over his property, his future, and his own peace of mind. The threats had only intensified, becoming more direct and personal. Redwood Enterprises, the local officials, and the shadowy figures behind the development project were no longer hiding behind veiled threats or legal maneuvering. They were taking action, aggressive, relentless, and designed to break him. But James, in his stubbornness, in his unyielding belief that the land he had restored was worth fighting for, wasn't going to bend. He had come too far to give up now. He was ready to see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The tipping point came when the development company filed for an injunction, seeking to force James off his property. They alleged that his resistance was damaging their reputation, threatening the timeline of their project, and stirring up unnecessary conflict with the community. This wasn't just a legal move, it was an attempt to choke the life out of him, to drown him in a sea of paperwork, bureaucracy, and intimidation. Their message was clear: step aside or face the full might of their legal and financial power. The fact that they had managed to sway a large portion of the local council, the very people who should have been his allies, made the situation even more insidious. Redwood's influence ran deep, and James knew he was about to face the most formidable challenge of his life. He had always been a man of action, a man who believed in solving problems with his own hands. But now, as the pressure mounted, he found himself pushed into a corner where he couldn't solve this problem on his own. The legal battle was far beyond the scope of what he could handle with just his own resources. Maria Ortiz, the investigative reporter who had become his closest ally in this fight, had continued to dig deeper into the web of corruption that surrounded the development project. But even with her help, it became clear that the only way to stop Redwood Enterprises and the local council from getting what they wanted was to expose the full extent of their actions. That meant putting everything on the line. Everything he had, everything he stood for, and trusting that the truth would be enough to tip the scales in his favor. The stakes had never been higher. Redwood Enterprises had already begun pushing their agenda through the courts, using every tool at their disposal to paint James as an obstructionist, a problem to be dealt with. In their eyes, he wasn't a man defending his property. He was an inconvenience, a nuisance standing in the way of progress. But James refused to see it that way. This wasn't about progress. It was about control. The land, the pond, the community, they were all pawns in a much larger game, a game that James refused to lose. He knew the truth. He knew that the land he had worked so hard to restore was more than just a piece of real estate. It was a part of his soul, a part of the fabric of the community that had nurtured him over the years. He wasn't about to let anyone take that from him. As the court date drew closer, James found himself grappling with the uncertainty of it all. He had spent so much time and energy preparing for this moment, but there were still so many variables, so many unknowns. The legal system was a maze, and Redwood Enterprises had the resources to navigate it with ease. James was no fool. He knew that they would fight dirty. They had already used every tactic in their arsenal to intimidate him, to undermine his credibility, and to weaken his resolve. But as the days ticked by, James found that his sense of fear was being replaced by something else, something more powerful: determination. He had fought for too long to let them win. The battle was far from over, but now, more than ever, James knew that he had to push forward no matter what came next. On the morning of the court hearing, James stood outside the courthouse taking in the sight of the building that would decide his fate. The sky above was overcast, and the air felt thick with the weight of the moment. He could see Maria in the distance, walking toward him with a look of quiet determination on her face. She had been his ally through this entire ordeal, her knowledge of the media and investigative reporting giving them the edge they needed. But even she seemed uncertain about the outcome. They both knew the odds were stacked against them. Redwood Enterprises had deep pockets, powerful allies, and the means to bury them in paperwork and legal technicalities. But none of that mattered to James. He had come too far to turn back now. This was his fight, and he was going to see it through to the end. As they walked into the courthouse, James felt a surge of resolve. This wasn't just about property rights anymore. This was about the future of the land, the future of the community, and the principle that no one should have the power to take what was rightfully someone else's. As they entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The room was packed with lawyers, representatives from Redwood Enterprises, and a few curious onlookers. The judge, a stern middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, took his seat at the bench and called the proceedings to order. The air seemed to crackle with anticipation as the battle began. The first few hours of the trial were a blur of legal jargon and formalities. Redwood Enterprises' lawyer, a slick and well-spoken man named Gregory Peters, presented his case with all the confidence of someone who knew they had the upper hand. He painted James as a man out of touch with the community, someone who was standing in the way of progress and holding up a project that would bring jobs, infrastructure, and increased property values to the area. He presented evidence of James's supposed violations of zoning laws, claiming that his modifications to the property had endangered the environment and violated the terms of the land's original deeds. Peters was smooth, calculating, and relentless. He made James seem like an obstructionist, someone who didn't care about the greater good. But James wasn't about to let that narrative stand. When it was his turn to speak, he stood tall, his voice steady and resolute as he addressed the court. He spoke of the history of the land, the restoration of the pond, and the deep connection he had with the property. He explained how he had always seen the land as a sanctuary, a place of peace and belonging. He talked about the community, the people who had lived in the area for generations, and how their way of life was being threatened by the development project. James's words were measured but powerful, and as he spoke, he could see the expressions of the jury shift. They were no longer simply listening to legal arguments. They were hearing the heart of the matter, the true stakes of the fight. But the real turning point came when Maria stepped forward. She had spent weeks compiling evidence, interviewing key witnesses, and uncovering the layers of corruption that lay beneath the surface of the town's development plans. With a calm and confident demeanor, she presented a detailed report of Redwood Enterprises' ties to local officials and their history of manipulating zoning laws for their own benefit. She exposed the backroom deals, the bribery, and the lack of transparency that had allowed this project to move forward without proper oversight. The room fell silent as she laid out the facts, her voice unwavering as she painted a picture of a town that had been bought and sold, piece by piece, by developers who had no interest in the people who lived there. As the evidence mounted, something shifted in the room. James could feel the atmosphere change, the tide beginning to turn. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of hope. The truth was finally coming to light, and it was undeniable. Redwood Enterprises, the local officials, and the entire development project were built on lies, corruption, and exploitation. The community had been blindsided, and now, with the evidence laid bare, it seemed like the court had no choice but to act. The judge, who had remained mostly silent during the proceedings, finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm as he addressed the room. He acknowledged the complexity of the case, the conflicting interests, and the weight of the decision before him. But as he spoke, James could hear the shift in the tone of the court. The power of the truth was undeniable, and it seemed that the tide was turning in their favor. James's heart raced as he waited for the final ruling. He had come so far, but there was still one more obstacle to overcome. He had fought for everything he believed in, and now it seemed that the truth was finally going to prevail. The judge paused for a moment as if weighing the consequences of his decision. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo through the courtroom, he delivered his ruling. The injunction is denied. The actions of Redwood Enterprises and the local officials will be investigated further, and the development project is temporarily halted until a full review is conducted. James couldn't believe it. The room erupted in murmurs, but all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat. The fight wasn't over. But this was a victory. A hard-earned, long-awaited victory that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. James had won the first round, but he knew that this was just the beginning. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. The truth had won, and with it, his land, his community, and his future. The courtroom buzzed with a low hum as James stood there, processing the judge's words, the ruling that had just changed everything. He had fought tirelessly for this moment, every step filled with doubt, with moments of uncertainty, with threats that had loomed over him for months. But now, it felt like the first real step towards the future he had always envisioned for his land. The future that seemed so elusive just days ago. The injunction was denied, the development project was halted temporarily, and the local officials, those who had been complicit in Redwood Enterprises' covert plans, were now under scrutiny. It was a victory, one that James knew was just the beginning, but it was a victory nonetheless. It was the kind of victory that would fuel him for the next stage of the fight. The initial euphoria of the moment slowly began to settle into a more practical realization of what lay ahead. Yes, the ruling was in his favor. But the truth was, this was just a temporary reprieve. The development project would not be abandoned. James was well aware of that. Redwood Enterprises would not simply roll over after one defeat. They were too powerful, too entrenched in the system. They had vast resources and connections, and they wouldn't back down easily. James knew that this victory had simply bought him more time to prepare for the next round of battles, to solidify his position and to gather more support. But the one thing that had changed irrevocably was that he now had the truth on his side. And the truth, James had learned through this entire ordeal, was a weapon far stronger than anything Redwood Enterprises could throw at him. As he left the courtroom, his lawyer, Langley, slapped him on the back in a rare moment of genuine relief. It was the first time in weeks that James had seen the usually reserved lawyer show even the slightest sign of emotion. They stepped out into the cool afternoon, and the weight of the moment began to settle around James. Maria was waiting for him, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. Her eyes sparkled with a quiet triumph, a sign of how much this victory meant to both of them. "You did it," she said, her voice a little shaky from the emotional toll of the trial, but full of pride. "I knew you would." James took a deep breath, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. "We did it," he corrected her, nodding toward her. "Without your help, none of this would have been possible." She smiled back at him, but there was a tension in her expression, one that James couldn't quite place. The victory had been important, but he could see the weight of the next steps already pressing down on her. "It's not over yet," she said softly, her voice low enough that only James could hear her. "This is just a battle in a war, James. You know that. They're not going to give up just because of one ruling." He nodded, his mind already racing ahead, thinking of the next moves they would have to make. "I know. But for now, we've bought some time. That's all I need. We'll use it wisely." In the days that followed, James found himself balancing between a sense of relief and the reality of the ongoing fight. He knew that Redwood Enterprises would be regrouping, preparing for their next attempt to push their agenda. The development project was far from over. What had been a temporary victory now required careful strategic thinking. James reached out to his neighbors, many of whom had been reluctant to get involved initially, but now, with the court ruling in his favor, they were beginning to see that standing up for the land meant standing up for their homes, their families, their way of life. It was a shift that James had been hoping for, a turning point in the community's willingness to resist the encroachment of big business on their quiet, rural existence. Through Maria's connections and the media attention that had started to snowball following the court ruling, James was able to garner more support. Local environmental groups, activists, and even a few former council members who had felt pressured to support the development project now began to voice their concerns about the impact that such a large-scale development would have on the local ecosystem, on wildlife, and on the very heart of the town. The narrative had begun to shift. It wasn't just about one man fighting for his land anymore. It was about the town, the people, and the legacy of a community that had been there long before the developers had even thought about turning it into a profit-generating machine. But even as the community started to rally, the shadow of Redwood Enterprises loomed large. The company was not one to accept defeat quietly. James knew they would regroup, recalibrate, and come at him again with everything they had. As he sat with his neighbors, strategizing about the next steps, he could feel the tension building. It was like they were standing on the edge of something, waiting for the other shoe to drop. James had already prepared for this. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew that his resolve was stronger now than ever before. They were in this together, and that made all the difference. Then, just as things seemed to be moving in the right direction, the next wave of pressure came. James received another letter, this one more threatening than the last. The developers had filed another appeal, this time asking the court to lift the temporary halt on the development project. Redwood Enterprises wasn't finished. They were taking their fight to the next level, trying to undermine the court's decision, trying to chip away at the progress James had made. The letter also hinted at a more personal consequence. James was now being targeted not only through legal channels but also through more covert methods. The message was clear: stop or else. The veiled threats were chilling, and this time it wasn't just Redwood's lawyers who were behind them. James had come to realize that there were powerful forces at play, forces that had no interest in letting him or anyone else stand in the way of their plans. The powerful, wealthy individuals behind Redwood Enterprises had their own agenda, and they would stop at nothing to push it through. James showed the letter to Maria, who immediately sensed the gravity of the situation. They had already been on edge, but now they were faced with an even more dangerous enemy. It wasn't just about the development anymore. It was about who controlled the land, who held the power to shape the future of the town. James was becoming more aware of the immense pressure they were under, not only from the developers but from the systemic corruption that had long been entrenched in the local government. It was a battle that wasn't just personal. It was political, economic, and deeply rooted in the history of the town. Still, James held on to the one advantage that he had: the community. The people who had started to rally behind him, who had once been passive observers, were now an active part of the resistance. He had awakened something in them, something they had forgotten in their quiet lives. They were starting to see that the fight wasn't just about one piece of land. It was about their town, their way of life, and the future they wanted for their children. And then came the moment that James had been preparing for. Redwood Enterprises, no longer content with simply trying to force him off his land, decided to take their battle directly to the public. A series of media ads, press releases, and statements were issued, painting James as a troublemaker, a man who was standing in the way of progress, a man who was more interested in keeping the land to himself than in the greater good of the community. The campaign was slick, polished, and designed to turn public opinion against him. It was a direct assault on his character, his integrity, and everything he had worked so hard to build. The media campaign was ruthless, and it hit hard. But James wasn't about to let them tear him down. Instead, he did what he had always done. He fought back. With Maria's help, they crafted a counter-campaign, one that exposed Redwood Enterprises for what they truly were: a corporation that didn't care about the community, that didn't care about the environment, and that didn't care about the people who had lived and worked in the town for generations. They used the same media outlets to spread their message, reaching out to local journalists, bloggers, and community leaders who were willing to stand up against corporate greed. The response from the public was overwhelming. People were starting to see the truth, and they were starting to take action. More and more of James's neighbors, friends, and even strangers from surrounding areas began to speak out in his favor. What had once been a small, quiet resistance was now a full-fledged movement, one that had gained momentum and was showing no signs of slowing down. But even as things were turning in his favor, James knew the fight was far from over. Redwood Enterprises had shown just how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. They would not relent. But James had come too far, and he wasn't about to back down now. With the support of his community, he was ready to face whatever came next. The battle for his land, his future, and the soul of the town was far from over. But James had learned one crucial thing through all of this. The truth, once revealed, couldn't be hidden again. And as long as he had the truth on his side, he knew he would keep fighting, no matter what.